All right, hey friends. It's Friday at 4, and that means I'm doing a live stream, and I'm glad to see so many of you already here. I just go ahead and confirm everything looks and sounds okay. I've already got a lot of comments already. I saw Paul Covey was first up. He's got a video that he wanted to make sure we covered today. It has Mark Holland giving some basic information, so we'll talk about that. I had a couple other people send that to me. Want to say hey to Ben from Dallas and William from North Carolina. Duncan, howdy from the home of Brer Rabbit. I didn't remember that Georgia was the home of Brer Rabbit. Eileen from Florida. Jennifer, milking the goats and listening. That is so fun. Jennifer wrote me and said, goats are really pretty great. You should get some goats. No, that was somebody else actually who said that they thought I'd been talking about how my family drinks raw cow milk. And he said, once you've had goat milk, it really is best. So that is on the agenda for us. Nathan says, good evening to everybody. So does Gabe, who's driving home from work in East Tennessee. I got Marianne, who's often joining us. No, I'm not going to talk about that. Never mind. DJ from the Gulf Coast of Texas with lots of emojis. Looks like you're having a good time. Hey, Jeff, how you doing, friend? And Edward, good to see you, brother. If there's anything we need to talk about from the WCA perspective, make sure and tell me, okay? Brenda, hey, from Alabama. Good to see you, sister. Philip. Yes, I did get your email about the Latham interview, and I appreciated it very much. I've actually thought of it several times since you wrote it to me. What Philip said was that it's in Ephesians, I believe, where Paul lays out the fivefold ministries of the Bible: pastor, teacher, evangelist. Forgetting the other two right now. Anyway, he was of the mind that Warren is clearly an evangelist, but not all elders are called to be evangelists. And so I had a number of people actually write me about that and say, hey, man, keep your head up. You're doing a good job. You're just not an evangelist. So he really pushed me on that. So I've spent a lot of time reflecting after the Latham interview on if I am doing right by my people here in Nowata and Delaware, if I'm extending Christ to them enough to resemble a biblical pastor or Christian. But then Philip, you and others have also given me stuff to think about with that. So thank you for following up. Hey, Howard from Wilmore and Bill, good to see you. Thanks for having Robert Worthington on, he says. He was a great guy and one of the smartest people I've ever met. He really is a smart guy. There's another Methodist nerd. Well, I can think of his name, but I shouldn't call him out. Who has written me, anytime I do something theologically astute, or I talk to somebody smarter than me, he writes me and gives me analysis on the things that I said that were right and wrong. He's really sharp. And I'm thinking, man, is there any way that I can just corral those two on a monthly basis to just speak very intelligently about things? Earl, hey, from Mount Pleasant, North Carolina. Okay, Jennifer, forgive me for forgetting. That was with you. Thank you for the encouragement towards goats. Yeah, my thing that's holding me back from goats right now is you have to have two of them, and you have to have enough grass growing high above their knees. They're not supposed to eat down close to the ground. So one of these days, Philip Lane says, well, I should look it up now. The fivefold ministry is in Ephesians. I got the book right. It's in chapter 4:11. So let's hear that. It's good to start off with some scripture, don't you think? Yeah, Ephesians 4:11. And he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers. So, yeah, I forgot prophets and apostles. So that's the thing. I mean, it always gets kind of screwy once you go in this direction. I don't know how many of you know what the New Apostolic New Apostolic Revival is, but there are a lot of people claiming to be apostles and a lot of people claiming to be prophets that are just full of it. And that's not to say there can't be any. Well, okay, so historically, I think it has been understood that after the original 12 and Paul, that you don't really have apostles in the same sense anymore. You have the apostolic succession, which is something that the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and even some Protestants believe in, but you don't really have people on par with those original 12 or 13, however you look at it. I'm not sure where I land on all that. And I'm sure that prophecy happens. Does it happen in the same way where we should put it in the Bible? I don't really think so. And my concern today is there's so many people who call themselves prophets. They make prophecies, but then their prophecies are not recorded or tested, and that's the clear scriptural mandate from Moses. So I just get real sketched out by that stuff. But teaching, pastors, evangelists, all that seems great by me. So, but yeah, if Paul is saying there he gave some to be apostles and some to be prophets, then yeah, there does seem a pretty clear expectation that those traditions maintain in some sense, or those functions within the church. So I'm going to step back from saying, yeah, if I said earlier that they don't exist anymore, I don't believe that. They clearly do biblically. Yeah, it's just a question of in what capacity do they operate. Philip, I don't know if you saw it, but in the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline, there's actually provision for evangelists within the structure of the GMC. It doesn't flesh it out exactly how that works monetarily, but it definitely by name says there's room for evangelists. So I'm interested in that, as I think a lot of people are actually. So maybe we can talk about that more at some point. Let me catch up on comments, and then I'll tell you guys what I was thinking about talking about today. Yeah, it's not revival, it's reformation. Thank you. Oh man, so many comments. Okay, so Paul Preble from Missouri, good to see you, friend. Paul from Great Britain, good to see you, friend. Chris from Indiana, man, it's wonderful having all you guys here. Jonathan, happy Friday, buddy. Resurrection Methodist Church in, is it pronounced Houma or Houma, Louisiana, will be consecrated this weekend. That's exciting, man. Congratulations. Hey, yeah, New Apostolic Reformation. Those guys are kind of wonky, but then the only people that correct them are the cessationists on the other side, which I'm not in their camp either. So I'm just kind of in this middle place going, well, you're kind of not biblical and you're kind of not biblical. And then, I'm the only biblical one really in the middle, right? Philip, sit on the charismatic pew with me and it will make more sense. Not on par, but certainly there are people with apostolic authority. Okay, yeah, it sounds to me like you and I are of the same mind then. Nathan says the understanding of apostles, which seems to be more in the sense of missionary. Yeah, apostello means one who is sent in Greek. That's where it comes from. So absolutely, yeah. DJ, if you only did half of what you described as outreach that you described in that segment, then you did more than most. Dude, I really, yeah, I used to really pour myself into it. And a big part of the reason I started Plain Spoken was I'm bearing hardly any fruit here. And rather than just kick against the pricks or the goads, I thought I would go upstream. And because it just seems to me like there's just garbage pouring into people from the outside. And there are some good voices that are trying to undo that, but we need more. And so I just thought I'll try and be a Methodist voice, and it's going pretty well so far. But I'm just really sick of all the traction that worldliness gets among even salt of the earth people who should know better. It's just everywhere they turn on the internet, even the youth, especially in a town. I just thought I needed to engage more, and the individual work on the ground level wasn't doing much. So this is my attempt. We'll see if it does much in the local context, but I thought, man, I need to do my part to engage the culture and make a more fertile planting ground. So Philip said there were some evangelists in the old Methodist Episcopal Church South, and I think its successors. I'd be interested to know more about that. We've got some history we can talk about today. So yeah, with that in mind, let's look at some of the history I was thinking about talking about. This is my screen. So this is what I knew we should talk about, the Tom Lambrecht article sent out by Good News. Oh, and I did want to urge you guys, if you haven't subscribed yet to my Substack, it's at jeffreyrickman.substack.com. You can tell I write about very interesting things. Last week I told you about the tale of the really mean lady And there's a moral to that story and some scripture. I always try and do something that points directly towards scripture and deals with the culture as it is right now. So uh, be on board with that. And then I thought I would just follow up on the things I've posted in the last week. Let's see. Okay. So I've posted 2 new additional segments on the transitional book of Doctrines and Discipline, which y'all stay tuned in. I mean, we're in the judicial phase now, and it's really hard, but it's important to know. Then I did a report. I listened to David Householder, who represented a church in California that's going through a litigious hostile takeover. That was interesting. Released another Considering Charlotte segment that Odell in particular really stole the show, but everybody who watches that really loves Simon as well. Just very plain spoken in the best sense of the word. Also very conscientious. I did an interview with Warren Latham, who's a megachurch pastor in Georgia. I think Georgia. So he really pushed me, as I said at the beginning of this segment, on evangelism, extending Christ to others, making a personal invitation, growing the church. The following day, I released a conversation I had with a Methodist apologist named Robert Worthington, and I was texting him just before this. I can't believe that's gotten more views than an interview with a megachurch pastor. I think that says that my base is much more interested in grassroots engagement with people than it is with big megachurch stuff. And so that obviously ties into what I talked about last week on the live stream, that large churches are not joining the Global Methodist Church as much. Of course, I can't fit in the nuance in the title. There are some mega churches that have joined in and are leading, and I think that's great. But it looks like the GMC is going to be marked less by big mega church culture and more by medium to smaller size churches, and that means that we are going to be more lay-led, and the laity is very interested. I'm noticing week to week as I'm talking about this stuff, laity are very interested in small group discipleship, how to do that accountable class meeting type stuff well. And then they're very interested in apologetics, engaging the culture around them and doing that better. So to be fair, Warren Latham did talk about that some, but the apologetics angle seems to really interest people. And I was actually kind of surprised at how many people were interested in the Arminian topic. I did an interview with, what was his name? Abishano, Brian Abishano. So I'm sometimes frustrated. You know, you'll see that this series I'm doing is getting the least engagement out of everything. That's my that's interesting. Sorry, one second. I'm noticing that as I'm looking at this stuff, you can't see it. That is interesting. Hold on. Why would it do that? Okay. I'm thinking there's got to be another way to do this. Hold on one second. There we are. Sorry, I know that was frustrating, guys, but it should be showing you now what I was looking at. It just froze on the last. You were only seeing that article that whole time. There's always got to be something, huh? Anyway, I was saying that it is frustrating that the Catechism series isn't getting more engagement, but I'm hoping that it does over time. It is going really well. I'm not going to stop doing it, but if you're wanting to engage your mind more on doctrinal stuff, that's really good. So, all right, I think I plugged everything I want to. Now I'll tell you the things I was looking at to talk about today. There are a couple that are firm, and then there are a couple that aren't. This one was kind of a culture war one. This is written from a person from the extreme left. The title is Segregating Bigoted Churches. I'm all for it. I read it like a week ago. So if y'all want a culture war thing, we'll come back to that in the comments. Just write culture war. This is a historical thing. Everything Riley B. Case writes is really good and historically informed. So if you want to learn about the history of ecumenism in Methodism, that is a worthy topic. We can talk about that. I wanted to talk about this last week. This is the article by Scott Field, the head of the WCA, on the upcoming UMC General Conference and how it's probably not legitimate. This is an article written on the history of bishops by Chris Ritter. So I thought that might be interesting. This is one of the have-tos. We're going to watch a little bit of this segment where he talked about the history. That's Mark Holland, if you don't know him, head of Action. History of missionary conferences, Methodist conferences abroad. He talks about a good deal of history, so it'll be interesting. I'll come back to this briefly in a second. And then if y'all want to talk about this report on how youth ministry is in tatters in America, a lot of people are interested in that, would like to hear about it. What's this one? Oh, yeah. That's connected to this. So this was the other thing that I really knew that we should cover. It's Lambrecht's article that he put out today on why Good News is going to be in Charlotte, even though they're advocating for people to leave the denomination. All right. Again, I'm sorry for that hiccup. Before we get into that stuff, I'm just going to check on comments really quick, and then we'll probably do the Lambrecht thing first, then the Holland thing first, and then if anybody votes for something else, I'll try and hit that as a third thing. All right, so, Jonathan Russo gave me a compliment on my Substack. Thank you. I would say I wasn't fishing for it, but I actually kind of was fishing for a compliment, so thank you. Shane is in favor of the history of bishop from Chris Ritter, so write that down. John Davis, good to see you from Oakland Park, Florida. Formerly, Harris Chapel UMC completed the last step to complete disaffiliation yesterday. You're free. Thanks for being there. That's great. So wait, they're still allowing disaffiliations in Florida? I thought I'm very interested to know this. Did I know this? Okay. Write a little bit more about that. I'm interested. Shane Fredericks says he wants to know about the preteen survey, so that's another vote there. And then Paul was just reading about a critical document for GMC convening. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to cover that in, probably about 6 weeks, maybe 7. TJ and I are going to conclude the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline series. We're going to come back, and there's a document that coincides with Section 8 of our Book of Doctrines and Discipline. It's called Judicial Policy and Procedures, JPP. And so we're going to go through that, and then we're going to go through this General Conference document as well. And then hopefully at that point we will know every single thing and be gurus in the science of global Methodist polity. So yeah, we'll be covering that, just not super soon. And then I always thank you, Chris Roberts. He's not the head of Action. Action was John Lomperis. It's Juicy Ecumenism, IRD. It's mainstream United Methodist. Thank you for that correction. I've actually had John Lomperis come after me once and say, you need to correct this. It's not us. I don't know why my brain does that. So anyway, okay. Let's... Yeah, Gabe, I do have less filter in my Substack. I don't intend to have a filter on video. It's just I anticipate. I can't phrase everything just perfectly, so there are certain things that I just know if I talk about it, it's going to be too sloppy. But when I get it in writing, I just say it how it is, and I cover my bases where I want to be covered. And if anybody has a problem with it, well, they can have a problem with it. But yeah, the Substack I deal with, you know how in vitro fertilization is in the news right now? I actually just happened to publish something on it 2 weeks ago that I thought I would get a lot more pushback on because I said it flat out how it is. And the people that sign up for my Substack, they really just seem to appreciate a clear word. I don't have hardly anyone argue with me. Not that arguing with me is bad, but it's just interesting how many people really do seem to appreciate just someone plainly saying things. So it's been fun to see how many people actually appreciate my good intentions. Um, Man, Gabe, you voted for ecumenism. We're all over the place today. DJ says, how many people do we need on a petition to get you to go to General Conference and cover it as news? So I think I can't go. Well, I could hypothetically go, but I think I can do a good job from afar. You remember my fifth child is going to be due in July, and that's only 2 months later. And my wife, we have like 5 kids at that point, and I just can't imagine leaving her for 2.5 weeks to be there. So I'm planning on submitting legislation. I'm planning on reporting on a lot leading up to it, and then I'm planning on live streaming, reporting, commenting on the live stream, and as well as talking to people who were there before and after plenary sessions. So hopefully I'll be able to scratch whatever itch y'all have around all that. What's the point of having all this knowledge? I don't do something like that. So I'm going to get some practice with the United Methodist General Conference here next month, and then hopefully I'll be much better by the time September rolls around. Yeah, Jonathan, if I asked Sarah Beth, she probably would say, yeah, go, you've built this, but she would be so miserable. And guys, this is how much my family loves me. And this is not bragging. I don't think I love it, but for Lent, I was fasting every meal for the first week. And they would sit down at every meal, and my son would just cry, and he wouldn't eat because I wasn't there to eat with him. And that's just kind of the flow of family life that we've got. There's no way I would ever be a bishop or a traveling evangelist for that reason. We're just homebodies. We love being at home and being with each other. So maybe once my kids are grown and out of the house, then I could think about maybe traveling some. But as it is, I'm here with my kids and my wife and my chickens and the internet. And the internet is what allows me to do this all right. So anyway, I take it all as a compliment, and thank you for saying those things. Chris Roberts says, 5 kids, a trip to Costa Rica seems like a good idea. Skip the conference and go to the beach. That's my nightmare, man. Managing 5 little kids. My eldest is going to be 8 at that point, and youngest a newborn baby. Heck no. Oh, you couldn't pay me enough money to do that. Jonathan, it's not bragging, family life. It is the best. It is the best. And Paul, yes, I am a blessed papa. Thank you, brother. All right, let's look at my screen again. Is it going to stall out again? Nope. Okay, here we are. Let's look at this. I doubt we're going to read the whole article, but, Tom explains why he wrote it. All right, let's get into it. Use our thinking caps, and then if there are any more recommendations on what topic we cover third, then I'll look at that in a bit. All right, so Lambrecht says, 2 recent stories from the United Methodist News Service deserve a response. The first was a news article about the announced intention of Good News and the Wesleyan Covenant Association to participate in the upcoming General Conference in Charlotte, North Carolina in April. So that UM News article is this one, where it has a picture of Tom right there. And I think that's John Lamperis and Beth Ann Cook. That would be from a while back. So this is an article that, he'll tell you what it said. The second article was a commentary by Reverend Lovett H. Weems, Jr., further criticizing Good News and the Wesleyan Covenant Association for our involvement. The argument voiced in both articles is that only those who have a long-term commitment to the UMC should participate in deciding the future of that church. In the words of the Reverend Drew Dyson, a delegate from Greater New Jersey, quote, "Our polity should be determined by those whose intention is to remain faithfully within the UMC. In my estimation, Good News and the WCA are simply attempting to undermine and harm the work of the UMC under the guise of fairness for their allies," end quote. There were a handful of other critical responses in the news article, and fair enough. It should be noted that both Good News President Rob Renfro and I remain ordained clergy in good standing in the United Methodist Church. That might be something not a lot of people know, but yeah, Lambrecht and Renfro have both put their money where their mouth is and stayed invested in the institution that they're trying to influence. That's an integrity move. Lambrecht says, since 1972, Good News has participated in every general conference by expressing our views on topics up for consideration at the conference. We have helped to organize like-minded delegates to support traditionalist positions on issues. Other caucus groups, such as MFSA, RMN, and other more liberal groups have engaged in similar activity at these same general conferences. In the past, The Love Your Neighbor Coalition has even recruited non-United Methodists to come and participate in protests that have disrupted the functioning of General Conference. I don't know about MFSA, but I know that Reconciling Ministries Network is only partially United Methodist. It's like the IRD. It has people in leadership that are not even United Methodists, but are trying to influence the United Methodist Church. So this is an apples to apples comparison here. Lambrecht says, our participation in the 2024 General Conference, however, will be different. Rather than lobbying the delegates on a host of issues of concern, Good News and the WCA are in Charlotte to focus on only two issues. First is the need to provide equitable, feasible disaffiliation routes for annual conferences and local churches outside of the U.S. who have been denied the possibility that we in the U.S. had to discern our future. So this is something that I've talked plenty about. Tom Bickerton, whenever he was the president of the Council of Bishops, just said paragraph 2553 does not apply to churches outside of the U.S., period. That was the end of it. And that's inequitable. That's why Edward Armel and many in the WCA have the Fair for Some, Fair for All campaign. If UMs in the U.S. could get out, UMs outside of the U.S. should be able to get out if they want to. And Lambrecht will talk more about that in a minute. Second is to support our African friends in their opposition to the proposed regionalization of the church. So that's new to me. I was under the understanding that Good News was willing to advance the cause of regionalization if caucus groups on the other side would allow for an easy exit for Africans or, non-Americans. It would seem that has fallen apart, and now Lambrecht and Good News are advocating for stopping regionalization and for allowing for disaffiliation from the UMC for non-Americans. Lambrecht says, we will not be in Charlotte to, quote, undermine and harm the work of the UMC, end quote, in any way, unless one considers enacting fairness and justice harming the work of the church. Now, that might seem kind of snarky, but that's a serious point. There are a lot of people who are so tribal at this point that if you're advancing just a universally good policy for transparency and integrity, depending on who submits it, they're going to stand against it. It's the same kind of like Orange Man Bad phenomenon where even if President Trump had a good policy, people were against it because he could do nothing good. This kind of tribal mindset that people get into where they can't like exercise their critical thinking or stand on principle. They just have their good guys and their bad guys, they're white and they're black, and they advance their that's what he's pointing out here is our agenda is good for the church, but if you receive it as bad, that's indicative that you're not thinking morally or critically, you're only thinking tribally. That's my language that I'm putting on him. I don't think he uses that language. We will not be lobbying, he says, on the budget or attempting to block changes to the denomination's definition of marriage and ordination standards. That was news to me because they are trying to change it. If you've watched my Considering Charlotte series, in the revised social principles are trying to get adopted, it clearly redefines marriage as between two people, not between a man and woman. So he's saying that Good News is giving up on that fight. They're just letting it go how it goes. And okay. He says, we will not be critiquing the proposed new social principles or weighing in on the number of bishops the church should have. The future of the UMC is for those who will be living with that future to determine. The question is, however, who will be part of the church? Will the church be a coalition of the willing or a fellowship of the coerced? And that's the key issue for me and so many is, okay, we got out. What they seem to want is this kind of sociopathic tendency to just and I've critiqued a lot of people who've done this in the Global Methodist Church who've gone independent. They're just, well, too bad they couldn't get out. We have concerns. We have green fields over here we're going to pay attention to. We don't care about them anymore. I just think that's a morally heinous place to be in. Just because you were privileged enough to get out doesn't mean that you can turn your back on those who weren't, So I think we all have to be invested from the inside and outside of the institution to facilitate an amicable split as much as possible. Otherwise, you're looking at still millions of people being withheld and kept in a fellowship that they don't want to be in. Now, Well, that's all I need to say about that for now. So let's go a little bit further with the article. Is disaffiliation over? Lambrecht says the heart of the institutional narrative is that, in Weems' words, quote, the period of disaffiliation is over. It is a time for all groups to move on from dividing to unifying and disciple making, end quote. Who gets to say that the period of disaffiliation is over? Institutional leadership in the U.S.? People who have already had the chance to discern the future of the Church? How can disaffiliation be over when more than half of the UMC has not had an opportunity to even consider disaffiliation, much less act on it? It's talking about non-Americans. If the shoe were on the other foot, would the charge of colonialism be leveled? U.S. leaders should not be the lone arbiters for determining that the privileges and opportunities available in the U.S. will not be allowed in the central conferences outside of the U.S. I haven't heard a serious argument about against this point. I've heard some people outside of the U.S. say, no disaffiliation, we're staying together. That doesn't really address American voices withholding non-Americans from disaffiliation and like the overt kind of racist undertones that has. You know, we'll let the rich, white, privileged people in America go who want to go, but you poor brown and black people, no, you don't have the muscle. We're keeping you. We're keeping your assets. There are some other questions of fairness. Oh, look at all these questions. Lambrecht says, how can disaffiliation be over when several annual conferences convince some of their churches to wait and to see what the 2024 General Conference does before considering disaffiliating? This happened a ton, by the way, if you've been paying attention. This is one of the things, I mean, right off the top of my head, I can remember Graves said that. Holston said that. There are a lot of bishops that along the way said, hey, we don't know what's going to happen at General Conference. And for that reason, withheld disaffiliations. Next one, how can disaffiliation be over when a dozen U.S. conferences impose such draconian costs on the process that it has been nearly impossible for churches in those conferences to afford to disaffiliate? So yeah, that's these cases in Pennsylvania or CalPAC, where they charged 50% of the real estate value of the church, or Baltimore, Washington. These are not the only conferences. These are just the ones that I can think of. He said there were about a dozen that were like this. Yeah, we're supposed to just forget about that and not care about them? How can disaffiliation be over when one annual conference said in late 2023 that churches had no grounds under the discipline or paragraph 2553 to disaffiliate and denied all further requests? What conference would that have been? That was North Georgia. Is he talking about North Georgia? That got busted back open by the state judiciary, so I'm wondering which conference he's talking about. I guess I haven't been paying good enough attention. And then how can disaffiliation be over when there are at least 4 lawsuits underway in annual conferences that have made it nearly impossible for churches to disaffiliate? All right, and I talked about some of that. Weems writes, quote, the upcoming General Conference is for those who remain after the chaos of recent years. They have chosen to remain not because they all agree, but because they are willing to live together despite differences, end quote. Unfortunately for Weems, nearly half the delegates there have not chosen to remain. They have not been given the choice. In denying them the choice, the Church has handicapped itself and compromised its ability to move forward in a new direction. This is something that I've talked about several times on Plain Spoken. It is not a coalition of the willing whenever you're restraining people from leaving. And if they want to seriously consider themselves a coalition of the willing, then they have to get rid of, they have to allow for people to leave if they want to leave. This is something Simon Mafunda has been talking about on Considering Charlotte. And they have to do what they can to remedy stuff, even in the United States, where people have been withheld. It really would be wonderful to see what they can do if all they've got on board is people who are willing. That would be a worthy experiment. But right now the experiment has been, how can we withhold as many people as possible, take their assets from them, and liquidate them in order to feed ourselves? And that's an ugly project. It's embarrassing that so many people are okay with it. I'm not going to read the rest of the article because I want to move on. But the exhortation I would have for anyone who's watching this now or watching it later is not just to pray for the United Methodist Church, but to keep your eyes on them and to exercise what influence you have right now on the consciences of those delegates who are going to be attending. I think if they're listening to people like Mark Holland, not Action, but mainstream UMC, you get the impression that disaffiliation is over. Or you listen to Weems, you get the impression it's over, it's done. No, there's still a final die to cast, and it's still very much up for debate what happens. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, start watching the Considering Charlotte series I'm putting out. It really is interesting, and got great people on board there. But if you've been one of these that is kind of tempted to turn your head and look another direction, you really shouldn't, not for at least another month and a half. Let's all be in prayer for the General Conference next month and do what we can to make sure that they make decisions that are for the benefit of everybody. Fair for some, fair for all, right, Ed? All right, before I go on to the video we're going to watch together, want to look at the chat again, and then we'll watch Holland's history. Nathan says, I take my 5 to the beach regularly in the summer. You're a bolder man than I am. That's great. Eileen, how did Susanna Wesley do it? How did she do it? She was a force of nature. Paul says, if you leave it till they're off hand, you'll be thinking about retirement. Yeah, you're true. I mean, that's right. We'll see. Sometimes my kids are all so far pretty good musicians and singers. I've thought how fun it would be to have a family band that kind of travels in a big van. I could imagine traveling in that way, kind of lackadaisically, but airports and passports and no. Jonathan says she was a strong woman. Yeah, absolutely. Steve Turner, prayers for the WCA lobbying for African churches wanting to exit it. Yeah, please pray for the WCA. They're universally maligned. I served in the WCA here in Oklahoma, and nobody had a good reason to hate us. Everybody hated us because that's who the institution hated. It's not fun. Bill said, I continue to be puzzled by the motivation of progressives forcing unwilling participants to remain in the UMC. It's despicable, yeah. Hey, Jeff Dollar, how you doing? He said, what happened in western Pennsylvania? It seems that nearly every UMC I drive by has removed the cross and flame and has new signs. You could maybe tell me better than I could at this point, but my understanding is there's still a National Center for Life and Liberty lawsuit going on with them. A lot is still up in the air, that Bishop Scholl has tried to stagnate any efforts to get out. I could be wrong. But yeah, if you're noticing that indicates that, I mean, I think a lot did pay out to go, even though the sum to go was really high. But others might be just saying, we're leaving, sue us. I really don't know. But yeah, that's kind of in line with the California pastor I talked to, David. I was saying it just a minute ago. He's just saying, just say no. What are they going to do? Just say no. What a guy. Jonathan says, is it just me, but why is the UMC driving a wedge in the culture divide? Well, okay, so this is very simple for me. You can tell who watches network news. They have like a hair trigger on not just Donald Trump, but any number of issues that they have been taught to. And this is what I was going to do a segment on in a little bit, but humans have been trained like Pavlov's dog to just at the slightest prodding lose their minds. And so the United Methodist Church, I don't think that they are the ones driving the wedge. I think modern media that is largely undergirded by special interest groups and government forces has very intentionally divided people. And people with this kind of institutional mindset do happen to overlap with people watching NBC, CBS, CNN, all those big dogs. Yeah, and even Fox News does it some, so I'll come back to this topic in a little bit, but I think the tail wags the dog here. I don't think the United Methodist leadership is actually leadership. I think they are slaves to these forces that have them under their in their thrall. DJ says, oh my, a traveling preacher. Wesley would be so pleased. Jonathan Russo, we can be different and still love each other. We can. Um, the thing that makes loving each other impossible is when we pretend we're doing the same thing, but we're actually diametrically opposed to each other. So, Maria Dixon Hall is an interview I did recently. She's an administrator, DEI leader at Perkins School of Theology. Really good conversation we had, but she didn't have much pushback on that. A lot of people are of the mind, can't we all just get along? And the answer is no. When we're using the same words but meaning opposite things by it, no, that's the point where we can't get along because it does violence to language and social fabrics. So anyway, I think I'm all caught up on. John Palmer says optics, and that is a good word to know. And I don't know exactly how he's applying it here, but it's an important thing to consider. All right, let's go back to the screen, and then I'm going to make sure that the audio is working before I go on, because I've tried to play things for y'all before, and they didn't work out. So I'm going to play just a couple seconds, and then y'all let me know if the audio works or not.
I'll give you a little bit of history about how we got here.
All right, could y'all hear that? And then once I hear a yes, I could hear that, we'll get into it. Oh, I could have turned it up here. Okay, you could hear it, says Nathan. Okay, very good. Okay, so this is obviously at Dumbarton UMC. I don't know what state it's in, but Mark Holland, head of Mainstream UMC, gave some history. I've put out some feelers to see if this history is inquiries to see if this history is legit. I haven't heard back from any of the experts I wrote yet, but we'll listen to it together.
You probably already know it, but in 1972, the General Conference decided that the prohibitions against divorce for clergy were no longer necessary, so they took those out of the Book of Discipline, but added in instead prohibitions against homosexuality, and added the language into the social principles that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And we've tried for the last 50 years to get that language removed. And it would have been removed already, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is the way it is. Sometime in the 80s, they were concerned that pastors were going to be gay, so they passed prohibitions on ordination, including...
So just real quick, I think Holland is right to say that the liberalism, the liberal impulse within Methodism, it didn't begin with divorce, but abandoning a biblical position on divorce directly did lead to the groundwork on undercutting other topics involving the nature of family and sexuality and all this stuff. So his point is well taken. That's at the very beginning of the denomination. 1968, I think, is when it was founded, but it was 1972 at that general conference that they really hammered out a lot of this stuff. And then he's going to make the case that he's going right into it. Conservatives just were really paranoid about gay people being gay and doing gay things. The only reason conservatives advanced these things was because there was activism on the left. There were already clergy that were advancing this cause quite dramatically and scandalously that then they responsively created legislation in response to. So it's a little bit disingenuous the way that he frames this here.
You cannot be a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which just introduced don't ask, don't tell into the church, which has its own harm. Then they thought people might want to get married. And so they added prohibitions against marriage in our churches and by the clergy. And then we shouldn't fund the gay agenda. I don't know what that is, but we're not going to fund it. So there was a funding ban put in place that said no money could go towards that. Probably the low point of that was in 2016 when there was a petition for the church to support anti-suicide measures for LGBTQ youth. And that petition failed. And I'm telling you, if we can't stand up for our kids to prevent suicide, what are we doing as a church? So all of these prohibitions have been in place.
So a lot of history, a lot of stuff thrown at us right there. One is anyone who says they don't know what the gay agenda is lying. It's normalizing non-normative sexual behavior in relationships. This is something that legislation was passed because they were, as a denomination, people within it wanting to advance the normalization of gay and non-straight sexual, not just identity, but exercise. And this was violated most recently by General Board of Church and Society giving a grant to Reconciling Ministries Network to write a curriculum for Vacation Bible School that is being used now, I think. So I've reported on this, but these are real things that were being done. It wasn't paranoia. It was in response to things that were being done. Now, I don't know the insides of what happened around them rejecting this. I don't know if it must have been a resolution, but if I were to be voting against something like that, it would be the specific emphasis on LGBTQ youth. Anyone with a heart is going to be against suicide in any youth whatsoever. But to focus on that one demographic, it creates a wedge where this is an issue where, well, and this is what liberals have done is if you do not take our position, you are causing the suicide of youth. You are directly resulting in these youth hating themselves and killing themselves. And so when conservatives refuse to participate in that narrative, it's not that they don't care about these people made in God's image, it's that they reject the framework for this stuff. So I don't think Colin's point is well taken here. And part of me thinks that he may be so small-minded as to really think that conservatives are just that hard-hearted, but I think he actually does understand, and he just knows that he gets points for being disingenuous with the bad guys. So we can go on a bit further. This does, if you're not interested yet, it does get pretty interesting.
How that happens, legislatively, there are different strategies. So those of you who have tracked the revised social principles, and that's the second R, know that in the revised social principles, there's new language proposed on marriage as well as on human sexuality. And there's actually stronger language around gender identity that has been included in the revised social principles. So that's the first R, removal of the harmful language. Second is to pass the revised United Methodist social principles. They have not been revisited in 50 years. They've been added to a process of accretion and deletion, and we've become a worldwide church. The social principles, the revised social principles, after 8 years, we believe, I was the lead staff in that process, working with Church and Society, we believe it's an appropriate theological document for a worldwide church that's succinct, biblically and theologically founded in the very best of our Wesleyan traditions. And it speaks to where we are today. So passing the revised social principles, deleting the harmful language. Third R is passing legislation on regionalization. Again, this is something that we share as caucuses with mainstream UMC as well as other strategy groups in the United Methodist Church. And so that leads me to the legislation. Now, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I'm not going to name paragraph. If you are a delegate and you're looking at the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate, you're going to see bless your heart. You're going to see three proposals. You're going to see one that's from the Christmas Covenant, one from the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters called Worldwide.
I think I accidentally skipped ahead. He was giving history. I shouldn't have tried to.
No written policy, but there's a practice at that time that when churches outside the United States grew to a certain size.
Okay, yeah, this is where I wanted to go.
Gay, so they passed prohibitions on ordination, including you cannot be a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which just introduced.
We'll just review this and then it'll get into the history.
Which has its own harm. Then they thought people might want to get married. And so they added prohibitions against marriage in our churches and by the clergy. And then we shouldn't fund the gay agenda. I don't know what that is, but we're not going to fund it. So there was a funding ban put in place that said no money could go towards that. Probably the low point of that was in 2016 when there was a petition for the church to support anti-suicide measures for LGBTQ youth. And that petition failed. And I'm telling you, if we can't stand up for our kids to prevent suicide, what are we doing as a church? So all of these prohibitions have been in place. And if you have any friends who are Presbyterians or Lutherans, I confess I do have some. You probably wonder, well, their churches moved past this 12 or 16 years ago. And what is it with the United Methodist Church?
Moved past this.
And it's because of our interesting global structure. So I'll just say a few words about that, and then we'll jump in.
You know, they moved past this biblical holiness thing a while back. What's with the United Methodist Church keeping holding on to biblical holiness? What's with these backwards people?
What the legislation is. Prior to the 1980s, in the 1980s, actually, the number
Here's the new piece of information. This is what I don't know is if it's true or not, but if it's true, this is very interesting.
of delegates from outside the United States to General Conference was about 8%. And there was a policy, a practice really, there was no written policy, but there's a practice at that time that when churches outside the United States grew to a certain size, they would become autonomous Methodist churches. They wouldn't stay in the United Methodist Church, they would become autonomous. So all of the Methodist churches in Mexico, Central America, and South America are all autonomous Methodists. They're not part of the United Methodist structure. That's also true for India, China, Korea, Malaysia, Australia. Now, Australia came from the British Methodists, so we're really not accountable for that group. But they're autonomous as well. So all these groups are autonomous. In fact, according to the World Council of Churches, there are 10 million Methodists in Africa. 5 million are autonomous, and 5 million are United Methodist, because the first group came of age prior to the 1980s when we had a different practice. There was no...
So this is where I need history buffs to say, okay, was it really the assumption that any missionaries sent out by the Methodist Episcopal Church or United Methodist Church or predecessors that once this missional area built up, that they would not try and be in fellowship with them, they would just set them loose and let them be autonomous, and that something changed in the 1980s? Well, he talks about why it changes, so that's the next thing.
Formal vote taken at General Conference, but there was a decision made in the 80s and 90s that instead of churches becoming autonomous, we would add them into the United Methodist Church. And there are 3 reasons for that. One is a good reason. The other 2 require different levels of cynicism. So we'll see how cynical you're feeling today. The first good reason is the United Methodist Church in the United States is overwhelmingly white middle class. And global diversity adds a richness to the church that can't be measured. It matters. The global diversity of our church matters.
I actually agree with him on that. I think most of us do. I was talking about this last week with the Korean American new annual conference, how really this separation is not good. I like that he can say that. It's obvious he doesn't believe in it because he's not willing to. It's not just him, it's a whole demographic in America that they'll give lip service to this concept, but they won't actually compromise what they want to do in the church. They do what Holland does and says, hey, we kick in 99.4% of the global money. We're going to do what we want to do. Don't stand in our way. We're going to advance our agenda, and we know that it's going to alienate most of the black and brown people, but that's our prerogative because we have the money and we are on the right side of history. So I like that he can see that. I don't like that he doesn't seem to actually believe it.
That's a good reason to include folks in the denomination. The more cynical reasons were, I don't know if you're aware, but in 1965, the United Methodist Church started a numeric decline in this country. Now, it's more fun to say this when my dad's sitting here, but it started the year he got out of seminary. And you just can't deny, I tell him all the time, Dad, you can't deny the correlation.
Har.
But the church started to decline. By receiving churches from outside the United States, we are no longer a declining denomination. We're now a growing church again. The other more cynical reason is some people at General Conference realized these were reliably conservative votes that could keep the church more conservative than the U.S. church would have been. If the U.S. church had voted just the U.S. church, we would have removed this language in the prohibitions on ordination and marriage 12 or 16 years ago. And we haven't been able to do that. So 8% in the 1980s. Right now, the number of votes is 45% from outside the United States. That's going to flip to 55% in 4 years. Right now, we have a disproportionate.
So he gets into the contemporary situation, and then that's where we are. So I'm going to read the comments here. I see that a lot of people engage this, but Tom Lambrecht actually knows his business. He was the author of that last article we read, and I asked him about it. He did get back to me. He says, this explanation from Holland is an incomplete explanation. It's not false. It's incomplete. He says, General Board of Global Missions actively encouraged autonomy for Methodist churches outside of the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s. They got the message. that they weren't really welcome in forming the United Methodist Church. That changed as time went on, and most Africans, Filipinos, and Europeans stayed connected. So what he is saying there pretty explicitly, to my mind, is that prior to that point, they were kind of racist as a denomination. We were kind of racist as a denomination. We did this mission work, but we didn't really want them affecting us. And then at a certain point, our consciences were moved to understand that people who are equally made in God's image deserve a seat at the table, and then that growth happened. Now, the other argument from Holland was that there were cynical reasons for this. We were in decline in America, but we wanted to have rising numbers. I don't have a hard time believing that, because a lot of United Methodist leadership did not like keeping accurate local church records on membership. They wanted inflated membership, and there were all kinds of incentives there. So obviously, yes, we love our big ballooning budgets and membership rolls. And then the other one was that conservatives noticed that people outside of the U.S. were conservative, and so they wanted them to join. To say that that was a primary driver, maybe, I don't know. I don't know these guys. That's what I'm really interested in. But, I mean, as a conservative, I don't need that, but it is icing on the cake. To my mind, I mean, it's just so weird how this whole conversation gets divorced from the scriptures. For those of you who watched the Considering Charlotte segment that I've got coming out tomorrow, we had Lloyd Nyorota on there, who's a Zimbabwean living in Canada. He's part of the Western jurisdiction, or I think he is. He was nominated as a bishop there. He is all on board with regionalization. He's one of the Christmas Covenant authors. He's a neo-Marxist. I don't know if he identifies like that, but he sees everything through the lens of oppressed and oppressor, and he thinks that Christians just need to leave each other alone. Like, that's what we do. And to a degree, I'm with him. I think Christians should not coerce one another, force each other against our will to do things. But I don't think that we should leave one another alone. I think that is unbiblical. I think the only biblical position to take is that out of love we interfere with one another. We don't force each other, but we do interfere with one another. And that's what's disappearing with regionalization. It's just, you leave us to our mess, we'll leave you to your mess, we'll have a few things in common. And I just think that that's theological. Like, I can't recognize that in the Bible. And I talked about a lot of this last week in the Korean American Conference thing. But I just think they've really warped the clear meaning of the scriptures to make room for doing what they want against the corrective of other people who know the gospel. You know, I guess so. I anticipate Holland would say, you know, if they were on our side, you wouldn't say the same thing. I just think there's the truth of the gospel no matter who's on what side. You know, I don't think the truth hinges. I mean, the only person whose side that matters with respect to the truth is Jesus, and he is the way, the truth, and the life. So any side Jesus is on, that's the side of truth. And the side of racial or ethnic separation is not of Christ. You know, it's frankly un-American. And so it's just crazy to me that we find ourselves at this point where we're segregating. So anyway, I'll read some of the comments, and then, oh heck, we're out of time, so I'm not even going to get to read another article. I'm sorry for those of you who voted. All right, I'll pull up the comments so you guys can see them too, and then I'll read through them. And I don't have a way to scroll for you guys, I'm sorry, but there were a lot of comments. I'll go back to, okay. Chris Roberts said, that's a minimalist approach to the history, but he's right so far. That was early in. Ed says, this explanation explains their strategy to remove the language and the later enforcement, and finally the funding restrictions. Yeah, I think you're right, Edward. Jeff Dollar said, my weasel detector keeps going off listening to this fella. I've watched a good deal of Mark Holland, and actually this is one of his less weaselly presentations, if you can believe it. And, you know, he's one of these people. This is the thing that drives me nuts about partisanship. There are a lot of people that I feel like I could actually get along with under the right circumstances, but because I don't want to say anything else mean. They're just mitigating factors that make it so that there are people that I would otherwise like that I take offense to, and I don't appreciate that. Nathan says, I don't personally know the details of what he's saying, but it has been my experience that anti-LGBTQ suicide support is pro-LGBTQ social reform. Yeah, and I said pretty much that. So, but yeah, this is what not just the left in the UMC, but the Democrat Party in the U.S. does. It's there's a problem we all agree on. Here's our solution. Oh, you don't like our solution? Well, then you want that to stay a problem. And it's like, no, that's not really what's going on here. We disagree on what needs to happen to ameliorate the problem. But that's harder to understand and use that critical thinking rather than that tribal part of the brain. So I'm sure Republicans do it too. I don't want to start that fight. Fred says Pennsylvania has 3 United Methodist conferences. Yeah, Susquehanna, Eastern Pennsylvania. I forget the other one. Western is mostly Orthodox conservative except for the city of Pittsburgh. That makes sense, yeah. This stuff largely tracks with urban-rural divide. Chris Roberts says, I was at 2016 General Conference. There were 2 petitions on teenage suicide, one targeting LGBTQ teenage suicide, the other more general. The more general one passed that supported ministry to all teenagers struggling. That's a really important thing. I wish I knew that history well enough I'm glad you wrote this because that shows the lie in what Holland was saying here. Holland wanted to paint a picture like we're so poisoned we don't even care about the youth anymore. That's not what was going on. Edward says, forgive me for saying, but legislatively, regionalization is a sideshow. The top goal is the language removal. Yeah, I read your article saying that. I still don't know if I agree with you or not. Part of me thinks that they have the energy for regionalization before they liberalize the position, because otherwise, it really is just a slideshow. If they just force it through, then everybody's leaving. So, but you very well could be right, Edward. I'm not going to fight real hard on that one. Paul says that was the practice with the Methodist Church in Great Britain, but they stayed in fellowship thereafter. So, okay, yeah, and that's what Holland was saying here, was the church in Australia came out of the church in Great Britain, and y'all stayed in fellowship. Eileen says global diversity does matter, but to them, their voices do not. Yeah, there's a whole shtick. People on the right will say people on the left care about diversity only in skin color, but if you believe anything they don't, that's when their tolerance ends. They're not tolerant of diversity of belief. They're only tolerant of diversity of the way you look, and that's where the problem is. Bill says regionalization equals segregation, and it undermines the Catholicity of the church. I think that's a very succinct and apt way of summing this up. Eileen says, how can regionalization be united? Yeah, it's an oxymoron. And then, okay, I don't know what you were laughing at, Jeff, but I'm sure it was funny. Gabe says, this guy is a prime example of projection. Yeah, if you don't know about the iron law of woke projection, I haven't talked about that as much lately, but yeah, when you yourself have bad intentions, then all you see in others is bad intentions. When you yourself are a liar, then your suspicions of other people lying goes way up. Jeff Pospisil says, complete change of subject. I just added lay leaders to my band meeting with great results over porn and gluttony. I would encourage you to do some episodes detailing how band meetings work. Yeah, that's needed, isn't it, Jeff? Particularly the porn and gluttony stuff. This is so rife across America that it's a huge problem. And maybe, if you hadn't been outlawed, you and I should do something together. Class and band meetings is something that we need to follow up on. Surely this is really at the heart of Methodism. We have no right claiming to be Methodists if we're not driving towards accountable discipleship in local churches. There was one more segment that I wanted to do, and I know we're over time, but I've got to get it recorded, and I got to publish it next week. There's a problem I'm running into, and that is that global Methodist leadership seems suspicious of me, and I don't know if it's just of me, but I've tried to create inroads to GMC leadership and try and build trust between grassroots people and GMC leadership, and I've been rebuffed. And that's not to say that everybody in GMC leadership hates me. I have a good relationship with many people, but I've kind of run into some complications lately, and part of this is probably because of me. On an episode of the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Disciplines series, I aired some information that was not public yet about the Task Force on Episcopacy, and that ruffled some feathers. There's a legitimate issue of control of information and how that works. There's also the reality, and this is kind of a bitter medicine thing. Whenever I did my segment on gay people in ministry in the Global Methodist Church and the kind of ways that we're thinking about identity in the Global Methodist Church, there were a lot of people who responded really negatively to that. Like, just kind of like, I did my best to paint a picture of like the nuance of the case and how it is that we understand that sexual orientation works and under what circumstances people who struggle could still be wonderful ministers. All that kind of went out the window for a lot of people who just wrote things. I'm not going to screen grab or call anybody out, but oh, this is exactly why, it's just the UMC 2.0. It's going to go exactly the same direction. This is why I'm not joining. Just the height of hyperbole, the emotional energy was just way up there. I contacted Keith Boyette to get a comment on him, and then he had his response that in some ways answered some of the questions, but it obviously wasn't something that they wanted to spend a lot of time and attention on. And I can't say they were foolish for that, because look at how much nastiness came out of it, And when you're trying to form a new movement and you want it to be positive and you want it to be dynamic, then a lot of these people who are dramatic complainers, they really ruin it, And so that's to my mind what causes this kind of institutional response, which is we're going to control the information. We don't need people like you helping us explain why we do things. Rather, people just need to look for the press releases and look at the official communications. And, otherwise, people like me apparently are just going to make it worse, because the American population can't be trusted to be adults. And that's what's really at the heart here. And this is what I think, there are a number of ways that the GMC needs to figure out who we're going to be. Can we be trusted to think seriously and in a nuanced way about things, or are we going to be emotional and reactive and manipulatable? The way that the United Methodist Church sees its people is they have a very paternalistic posture. Rob Renfro has written about this. They don't want people getting the full gamut of ideas and information. They want to limit the information people are given. They want to restrict who has access to information. They are not at all transparent or accountable. A lot of people are fed up with that, but the opposite extreme is what I suggest, which is absolute transparency, absolute democracy. Put all the information out. Don't let anything be done behind closed doors. Have records of everything. Most people, once they hear that, go, I don't know about that. I think I'm right. I think that has to be the way in the culture of the GMC if it's not to become the UMC 2.0. But there are a lot of very intelligent, very faithful people who disagree with me about that. And they look at the very emotional and hyperbolic responses to my example was the reporting on homosexual people in the pulpit. And they go, no, people can't be trusted with this information. And so similarly with the Episcopacy Task Force, a lot of people have very strong feelings about what happens with bishops, and we can't trust people to be helpful in the dialogue process. So we're going to have the people that we think are best for the conversation, and we'll put something out afterwards to report on the conversation and what we had. And that's all done with good intentions. So, there are a lot of people who look at this stuff and they go, oh, they're all meeting behind closed doors and they're secretive and it's the same thing over and over. And that's exactly what I'm attacking right now, is this very Neanderthalic way of thinking through things where there's enemies and there's friends and there's nothing in the middle and there are no ideas to discuss. All of Plain Spoken, everything I'm doing is trying to create a different form of rhetoric in our denominational life together that is not so polarized. And so you'll notice I don't do like the culture war porn that a lot of people do. I'll talk about the topics, but I don't get worked up about it. I don't get angry about it. I sift through the ideas and different convictions at play. And this is what I think everybody has to learn to do if we're going to have a grassroots movement, if we're going to have a transparent denomination. I think we have to do this stuff. Otherwise, what we are going to see is an institution that takes a defensive posture against its own people. And then I think we see the whole cycle over again. I think that would be really unfortunate. So maybe it was unwise for me to even talk about this publicly. I've sought out private conversations. They haven't gone very well. They haven't cussed me out or anything, but it's just been, you need to understand this is the limitation here. And I don't want to do any kind of public campaign or anything. I'm not pushing for let anybody know about this. I'm saying I want people in the GMC to resolve to be adults. I want them to resolve not to fan flames of paranoia and anxiety, but to, in a very mature and adult fashion, you know, be a part of a healthy, robust dialogue. And so I don't think that that is a fictitious thing to ask for. I mean, if you're an American, I know we have, Paul, you're British, but British people can do this too. But America was built on the ideal of an informed populace. And in order for a populace to be informed, they have to have access to information. So I want to share good information with you guys, but that depends on you guys in some measure. That depends on how you act on the information that I give you. And if I've ever done anything that has like whipped people up into a frenzy, I need to repent of that. I need to find a way to talk that doesn't whip people up, but I need a commitment from y'all that you are going to be reasonable and mature in the information that you have. I don't want to be a divisive force. I want to be a unifier. But if the unity is based on party lines and press releases, then I think it's a false unity. I think we have to have transparency. So I'll let y'all know what comes out of this. I might get in trouble for talking about it. I don't know if I'm even going to leave this on the internet later. But it's just been really working on me. Like, I don't know if people understand what's at stake here. The Global Methodist Church could be something so great and amazing, but a lot of that gets screwed up by the people. So the people need to collectively agree who we're going to be, and we have to agree to be mature adults. So I'm going to look at the comments real quick, and then we'll pray. I'm already 11 minutes over. All right. DJ says, class and band meeting training is needed badly. Absolutely. Edward Redarmal, I feel for you. All from that apparent misquote from Boyette. We just asked for clarity. Steve Turner says, do we need to have those with overreactive personalities jumping into a new movement that needs positivity and deeper sense faith in the new movement? Yeah, I think that's a good word. Is if you are the type to fly off the handle and get dramatic, maybe the Global Methodist Church isn't for you. You know, yeah, we have a unity that we need to look out for, and that sort of behavior. I was looking at Friends of the GMC earlier today. There was a topic where it was an article Ed Redarmal posted talking about stories are not gospel or something, and some guy didn't even read the article. He just reacted nastily and spun people up. And then David De Silva, the professor, said, I don't know that this group is a good fit for this guy right here. And that's true. We need to exercise that discernment and, to that degree, exclusivity. I think people need to be shown the door if they can't play well with others. Thank you for that, Steve. Gabe says, if the GMC isn't careful, they will miss an opportunity truly to make changes and be primitive Methodists instead of just less liberal United Methodist Church. Yeah, that's one of the many decisions before us right now. DJ says, it's true, we might be a little paranoid. Absolute transparency is required now. You and I are of one mind about this, but not everybody is on the same page as us. She says, same thing again. Eileen, as Christians, we should be willing to listen to others and then test it with the Bible. Absolutely. Yeah. Be good Bereans. Gabe says, super chat. Oh, thank you, Gabe. I appreciate you. And Brenda, you agree. I wonder if there's something we disagree about. If there is, I don't want to find it. All right. Well, listen, we're at the end of our time together. I appreciate all of you spending time with me and thinking about heavy and important things with me. If anybody has additional historical follow-up on what Mark Holland presented here, I'm interested. You can always email me at plainspokenpod@gmail.com. And then if you are not a supporter of Plainspoken yet on Locals, you can go to plainspoken.locals.com, and that's where you can become a supporter. And I put stuff on there early for people to see and sometimes do private live streams. So consider joining. All right. I haven't asked for prayers, but we're over time. So how about I just pray whatever comes to mind and we'll adjourn for today. The Lord be with you. Father, we thank you for the time we've had today. We thank you for the Global Methodist Church and the hope and the promise that it has for all of us. We thank you for the ways in which it has not been like the United Methodist Church, and for the liberty that we've experienced in these fellowships that are more spirit-oriented and less demanding in worldly ways. But Father, The Global Methodist Church needs faithful people to be active right now to form a new culture. And if we fall back on old ways and seeking comfort, we're not going to be who you require us to be. So we pray that you would raise up strong laity and clergy for the days ahead. We want to thank you for the leadership currently at the helm of the Global Methodist Church. It has not been an easy thing for to build or maintain, and we ask your blessing upon all those who have signed up to lead. We ask, Father, that regardless of what happens with the Global Methodist Church or the United Methodist Church, that you would help us to be faithful. In the end, we can only carry our own loads, and it's easy for us to get distracted with the faults and frailties of others without looking at ourselves. But we ask, Father, that you would help us to act in proper measure, that you would help us to be much more concerned with the logs in our own eyes rather than the motes in others, and that you would so perfect us as to spread scriptural holiness across the land once again. Father, a big part of that depends on classes and bands being formed again, and we pray that you would keep pressure on church leadership to form these bodies and save people from their sins and experience the freedom and peace that only comes from the power of the Holy Spirit. Lord, may we be so blessed as to be a part of a movement like this. Father, if it be your will, we pray that we would see the fire of the Holy Spirit on this movement once again. We ask these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen. All right, that'll conclude our time together. I've enjoyed it. I love hearing from you guys and how you respond to stuff, so keep me in the loop with what's going on, and I have more stuff coming out over the next week, and I'll see you next Friday. Bye.